mysterious. Well, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Hope y'all have something to be thankful for this year. Thanksgiving 2024 is already here. Let me apologize in advance real quick. I got a real bad cough right now. So if the narration in this episode sounds kind of chopped up, it's just because I'm editing out my coughs. For everyone's sake, we don't need to hear that. But I did want to get an episode out here on Thanksgiving. Have a little fun with y'all this morning. Today's episode comes to us from a resident of Alberta, Canada. And here's what he has to say. It was 2007 when my partner and I went up to the Wells Gray Provincial Park on a moose hunt. We took my ram north from Clearwater Station onto the secondary road, which eventually turns into an unpaved road. It was a rough and bumpy go for almost 10 miles. Eventually, we reached the southern tip of Clearwater Lake, where we would make camp and begin our hunt. The plan was to work the timber going northward around Clearwater, Azure, and Hobson Lakes until we found what we came for, which was a big bull moose. Our base camp was to be the truck. We were backpacking a small mountain tent and light supplies. The reason being that if we bagged a moose, it would have to be butchered and carried back out. This scenario is rough enough if you're close to your camp. But should we get our mark up by Houston Lake, it would require several trips with a lot of heavy meat on our backs. There is some extremely challenging terrain in here, even for a seasoned hiker. But when you add 175 pounds of meat to the pack, it can get really interesting in a hurry. On our first day out, we'd patrolled the eastern edges of Lake Clearwater with little results to show for our efforts. We'd called in one bull that was relatively immature and had seen a couple cows as well. That afternoon, we hiked back to the truck and spent the night under the stars, pondering our plans for the following day's hunt. At sunup, we were heading due northeast for the eastern end of Azure Lake, which was a spot we'd tagged a huge bull several years ago. Now, Azure had proved to be more promising than what we had seen near Clearwater. But still, we were not committed to the fact that there was nothing better to be found elsewhere. Once again, we withdrew from the timber, leaving ourselves enough time for the 5 or 6 mile trek back. The next day, we were committing ourselves to something serious, putting on some miles in hopes of attaining our goal. To reach the lower end of Hobson would be 6 miles one way and over 12 to the northern end, keeping in mind that anything shot up there would have to be butchered and carried out the same way we'd come in. We crossed through the shallows in an area where the three lakes meet and started to work the lower, narrower portion of Hobson Lake, heading north. The day turned bleak and it started to rain. First, very lightly, and then more heavily. We were nearing midday when our call sounded like it was attracting something more along the lines of what we came for. As we watched and called, a huge old bull came plowing through the brush, about 100 yards out from our position, and he was committed. We waited and continued to call. When he was about 40 yards out, my partner pulled the trigger. The bull dropped where he stood. We huddled around the beast and began the task of butchering the meat. By the time we'd finished, we'd have barely enough time to make it back to the truck, let alone making 2 trips with the spoils. Now in these woods, there are a fair amount of grizzlies, so our plan was to bag what we could, and what we couldn't carry back, hoist into the trees, coming back for it the next day. This is an extremely dangerous scenario to enter into, and I don't recommend it to anyone. The butchering site alone will be enough to attract a bear from miles away, and we wouldn't be coming back until the following day. This is the day we refer to as entering the danger zone. For good reason. Many a hunter has been mauled or killed coming across a bear in such a situation as this. We lifted the remaining meat off the ground some 15 feet, hanging it from a stout pine bough, and commenced with our hike back to camp. Between the 2 of us, we were carrying well over 300 pounds of meat and had a solid 7 miles ahead of us. If you think that's easy, well, think again. By the time we made it back to camp, my body was burning from head to toe. We collapsed by the fire for a well-needed bite to eat and some rest, knowing that we had to return early tomorrow for the remaining spoils. Throughout the night, and continuing into morning, it was raining hard. And despite the weather, we began our hike back into the danger zone. By this time, there could easily be one or more bears in the area, having sniffed out our previous day's activity. The forest was extremely tight and dense where we'd hoisted the meat, so as we neared the area, our hiking speed had come to a crawl. There is no moving quickly as you close in on the zone. Every step and every move is meticulously plotted out and taken, looking in every direction and at every turn for a bear that may be awaiting us. The rain was unrelenting as we approached the site. It was nerve-wracking in that the noise from the rain alone would drown out any sounds that an approaching carnivore might be making, and we were on edge. As we came into the site, both of the sacks were gone from the tree. One of the ropes was still tied to the tree's trunk, and the remainder was laying on the ground. The other rope was still hanging over the bow, but the rope's end was snapped off, with the sack being taken. As we were taking all this in, we were still very much on guard for anything else that may be approaching or in the vicinity already. At this point, the rain was coming down in buckets, and the ground was saturated around the site. I was standing, looking at the rope hanging from the bow, when my eyes were suddenly drawn downward. Below me and all around me, in the wet peat, were enormous footprints throughout the entire area. I put my boot alongside one of them, and they were double that of my own, which made them about 20 inches plus. And the 2 of us stood there completely aghast at the spectacle of what we were seeing. We both knew that these were the prints of a Sasquatch. A Sasquatch that had just taken our remaining moose meat. I don't think that either of us in that moment could fully accept what it was we were looking at. We'd heard the stories and we'd seen the film clips and the like, but now this beast had become part of our own reality. We were looking down on the footprints of something that is said to not exist, and now we had proof. You'll have to trust me, and yet, having said that, it's more than likely you won't, when I say that there was positively nothing around in these parts that could have left such tracks other than a Sasquatch. As we gathered our composure, we could now see where the beast had entered the site and where it had exited. There were hundreds of deeply compressed prints in the peat, coming and going from the same point in the woods, indicating exactly where it had traveled. Having nothing left to do but hike back, we left the site and returned back to the truck. One of the most amazing aspects of this was the thought of a single creature snapping a half-inch thick piece of climbing rope from a bag dangling at 12 feet off the ground and then making its way off, single-handedly, carrying some 350 pounds of meat and perhaps more. Whether or not people choose to believe in their existence is of no consequence to me from this point forward. We now know for ourselves beyond the shadow of a doubt they exist, and they're roaming the forests of British Columbia at the very least. Just to reach that height and have the strength to snap climbing rope should put the fear in anyone, in my opinion. Well, what do y'all think of that? I'm sure most of the listeners here actually don't have a problem believing it. But yeah, like you said, it's still a hard pill to swallow that these things are real. But seeing is believing, and even though they didn't directly see one, they saw enough. So, well, there it is, y'all. Happy Thanksgiving again. You know what? I have an idea. It's Thanksgiving. Instead of sandbagging this next story for another episode, why don't we just make this one a double header? I do have a Bigfoot encounter sitting right here out of Mississippi. Why don't we jump right into it? This one comes from Willis Jameson, a longtime resident of Mississippi. Now, smack that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and let's get into it. It was 1964. I'd graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy with full vessel captain certification. After graduation, I'd already put some feelers out for my employment and was hired with a large sea salvage, dredging, and dock building firm. Virtually all of our work was in and around Mississippi, the Delta region, and the Gulf of Mexico. During my downtime, I did a fair amount of small game hunting as well as deer around the state. It was late one morning and I was sitting in a greasy spoon having a cup of coffee and some eggs while sitting wearing my camo. The place was quite crowded and I was sitting at the table. A gentleman asked me if I would mind if he'd join me at the table. Of course, I told him. I'd be more than happy to have a little company for breakfast. I introduced myself to him and him to me. His name was Joe. As the conversation developed, Joe quite naturally had noticed that I was wearing camo and said to me, "So you're a hunter?" I replied, "Yes, sir," and told him that when I was not captaining, I spent a fair amount of hours in the woods. As the conversation went back and forth, he came around to telling me that today may be my lucky day. Naturally, I responded by saying, "What do you mean by that?" He went on to say that he knew an old codger in Leffler County and had a real nice piece of land chock full of turkeys and deer, and that he was looking for a decent bloke to hunt the land for him in exchange for food. I said to him that it sounded like a real interesting deal and that I'd like to make his acquaintance. I passed my number on to Joe, and several weeks later, after I'd returned from the next job, I was at the home of Gerald Holmes. When Gerald answered the door, he was a half-crippled old man, 96 years of age, and he invited me inside. The house consisted of 6 rooms, none of which were fit for human habitation. It reeked of cat piss, and there were bugs crawling around on everything, including the furniture. He asked me to have a seat, and without trying to be rude, I said my back was really sore that day, and perhaps we could just go outside and have a look around the property. Well, the two of us walked outside. He told me that he'd never married and that the land had been in his family for 4 generations. his home was accessed by a dirt road that was approximately a half-mile long. The surrounding land was over 250 acres, which abutted some federal or state land. I don't recall exactly. Gerald told me that for the past 14 years, since his legs had gotten bad, he'd always had an arrangement with some hunter for a 50-50 split on anything shot on the land. This was so he would have food to eat, and for no other reason. Prior to his legs going bad, as he called it, he did all the hunting and trapping himself, and lived entirely off his land. When I asked him what happened to the last hunter, he said he didn't know. He told me the man had been hunting and supplying him with turkey and venison for almost 5 years, and just fell off the planet, as he said. He never answered his phone anymore and didn't respond to his letters. I could see coming into the land, as well as now standing here, that this would be a great spot to hunt, and came to an agreement with Gerald to be his new hunter. He said to me, "I hope you can start soon, 'cause I'm getting a little hungry these days." As it turns out, I was a week away from my next job, and I told him I would hook him up the following day with some grub. He handed me a photocopy of a hand-drawn map of his land and pointed out to me the various places where I could access sections of it, as well as the surrounding land with my truck. We parted ways for the day and hand shook as Gerald said to me, "Nobody will ever bother you in here. You can hunt wherever you want." The next morning, I'd chosen what I'll call a back area of his land, where I parked my truck and walked in with my bow. Well, it was like taking candy from a baby. Having never hunted in here before, I immediately found a well-worn trail and set up off the side in waiting. It was less than 40 minutes later that 7 does and a buck came sauntering by, and before you knew it, I was butchering a doe in the woods. As I made my way back out to the truck, a note had been rather mysteriously placed on my wiper blade. I pulled the note from under the blade, and it read as follows: "Be careful in them there woods, fella. The cinnamon man will get your sorry ass for sure." And that was it. There was no signature and nothing else written on the paper. My first thought was, what the hell did I get into here? I went back over to Gerald's house with the deer and the note in hand. Gerald was thrilled with my quick success and was grinning ear to ear with joy. It was then that I showed him the letter, which had been placed under my wiper blade. I asked him point blank, after he had a moment to think about what he had read, "What the hell is the cinnamon man?" The two of us sat down on the bed of the truck as Gerald calmly and deliberately started to spin quite a yarn. He said that as far back as there were people inhabiting this neck of the woods, there have been stories and tales of large, hairy wild men living in these parts, the largest in these days and times being cinnamon or rust-colored, and immense in its size and proportions. Gerald said that many of the area residents have blamed this creature, and apparently others like it, for the theft of livestock and the like. He then went on to say that its presence can be noted with a howling and is heard in the woods. He added that he had never personally had any encounter with the beast, nor anyone he knew. As we sat on the tailgate, the thought had occurred to me of his previous hunter not showing up anymore, having been faithful for so many years. But in the moment, I just tucked it in the back of my head. It was such a beautiful and promising spot that, in spite of this cinnamon man rubbish, I decided to stick it out and give it a go. In the months that followed, I had a tremendous amount of success in these woods, and as a matter of pure convenience, I couldn't have asked for a more suitable hunting ground. I was bagging squirrels, raccoons, possums, everything else you can imagine. And Gerald was more than content to have all of them. In fact, he was at the point that he was now bartering with some other locals, exchanging his meat for other items, such as honey and bread, milk, and vegetables. It was 2 years into this arrangement with Gerald that I was deep into his property one day with a .22 caliber long rifle, and had a fairly powerful scope on it. I used this gun to bag crows and squirrels in the trees, which was a lot of fun. Now, I have to tell you before I continue that at this point in time, I knew every sound that emanated from these woods and then some. I was walking slowly, following a game trail with my eyes fixed in the canopy above, when I heard what I will describe as an odd imitation of an owl. You have to trust me here that I knew what an owl sounded like, and this sounded a little bit off, if you catch where I'm going with this. This owl noise kept repeating over and over again, which is not like that of a real owl. It sounded like a man trying to do an imitation of an owl, and not that very well. My eyes were fixed in the forest surrounding me as this odd sound was coming from multiple directions. In the heat of the moment, I started to feel very uneasy and began to retreat the way I had come in. The sounds kept pace with me as I walked. For whatever reason, I turned my head quickly to one side and saw something duck behind a tree off in the woods. As soon as that happened, I mounted the gun to my shoulder and was looking directly at the tree through the scope. I could see a large, rust-colored, red, hairy arm wrapped around the side of the tree and nothing else. I stood there watching the upper torso of a huge, hairy beast peering out from behind the tree. Its eyes were locked with mine in the scope. The creature was, in my estimation, 7 to 8 feet tall and very muscular. Its upper back muscles met with the level of its head almost to the crown. The shoulder and arm, which I could see, were thick, unlike anything that I had ever known or seen. It was staring right at me in a fashion that was almost hypnotic, seemingly having no fear or knowing that I was pointing a loaded gun directly at it. Its eye was large and glassy, jet black in color, and I didn't see it blink so much as once. As I was watching it, I once again heard the owl sound coming from several directions around me. I took the gun down to have a look around, and when I did so, the creature that was behind the tree took off at such a rate of speed that if I hadn't seen it out of the corner of my eye, I would have thought that it disappeared. It covered well over 100 feet, vanishing into the trees before I knew what happened. The woods had suddenly become silent. I hustled to get back to the truck as soon as I could. I was standing next to my truck, putting my gun away, when a local sheriff pulled up next to me and said, "Did you have any luck?" He got out to check my weapon and my license, during which time I told him, "I don't know if you'd call it luck or not, but I just encountered a huge hairy monster in the woods back there." The funny thing is, he didn't look shocked at all when I made that statement. He simply said, "Can you describe what you saw to me?" Then I said to him, "It was red or rust-colored, like a giant ape or hair-covered beast that was all muscle, like nothing you've ever seen in your life. I had my scope right on it, and we were staring right at each other, eye to eye, for over a minute, when it suddenly darted away at an incredible rate of speed into the woods." The sheriff looked straight at me and said, "Sir, you just had an encounter with the Cinnamon Man. Congratulations." With that, he reached out and shook my hand. Well, as you can imagine, I was blown away by this whole turn of events, including now a handshake from a local sheriff. He went on to tell me that the department had many calls about the creature through the years, and that he actually believed he'd seen one ducking into the woods on the edge of the bayou one night himself. I went back to Gerald's house and told him all that transpired that day, including my meeting with the sheriff. He wasn't surprised at all. In fact, he seemed rather calm about the whole thing. I thanked him for the time I spent and told him I wouldn't be coming back anymore to hunt these woods. We shook hands as he nodded in acceptance, and that was the last I ever saw him. Well, there we have her, folks. Cinnamon Man, Mississippi. Let me know in the comments if you ever seen a ginger Bigfoot. And if you've had an encounter with anything mysterious, you know what to do. Drop me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Happy Thanksgiving again. Enjoy your turkey. Bye for now.